Whispers in the shadows. Sarah sat by the window. The soft hum of the rain against the glass, the only sound in the quiet house. The storm had rolled in without warning, casting the world outside into shadows. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, charged, with the kind of tension that only comes when secrets linger in the air. She had tried to ignore the pull in her chest, the gnawing desire to leave everything behind. But the truth was, she couldn't. She glanced at the clock, 7:45 p.m. Ben was working late again. She had stopped asking him about his hours. It was easier not to. Their conversations had grown shallow, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them both. He'd been distant for weeks, but she couldn't blame him for it. She was the one who had changed. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. One new message. Ethan. Her heart skipped a beat, the familiar rush of excitement mixed with a surge of guilt. She opened the message with trembling fingers. I'm waiting for you. Tonight. You know where to find me. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ignore it, to shut down the impulse that had taken root in her, but she couldn't. Ethan had promised her that tonight would be different, that this was the night they'd finally cross a line that neither of them could ever come back from. With a sigh, Sarah pushed the phone aside. She didn't know how long she could keep up the charade, the facade of a perfect wife. She'd been playing this game for months now, sneaking around behind Ben's back. The affair with Ethan had started so innocently, just a conversation, over coffee, an innocent touch. But that had changed quickly, spiraling into something far darker, something more dangerous than she ever expected. She had no way of escaping now. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She froze. Ben? Her stomach twisted. He was supposed to be working late. It couldn't be him. Slowly, she moved to the door, her breath shallow, every nerve on edge. Another knock, this time louder. She opened it. There was no one there. A chill ran through her. But it wasn't just the cold air from the storm. It felt colder, like something unseen was standing just outside the door, waiting. She stepped into the doorway and glanced down the empty street. The wind howled, but everything was still. No signs of life. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure in the distance, moving slowly towards her. Her heart raced. Ethan. She quickly shut the door behind her, feeling a twinge of unease in the pit of her stomach. But her desire to see him, to feel that rush of passion, overpowered everything else. She grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the storm. The streets were empty. The only sound, the pounding of her footsteps and the relentless roar of the rain. The old house on the edge of town loomed ahead of her, its broken windows like hollow, eyes watching her approach. She had heard the stories, the rumors about the house, the disappearances, the whispers in the night. But tonight, those stories felt different. Tonight, they felt real. As she stepped inside the gate, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Ethan was waiting. She could feel him there, just beyond the shadows. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The hallway was dark, the air thick with dust. She shivered, her pulse racing. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't Ethan, not exactly. He stood taller, his face obscured by a shadow, his presence more imposing. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy as he stepped closer. His eyes gleamed, cold and unreadable. "Ethan?" she whispered again, confused, fear creeping into her voice. "Where are you?" The figure tilted his head slightly, an unsettling smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Ethan's not here, Sarah." Her breath hitched in her chest. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his. There was something about him, something wrong. His presence felt like it was suffocating the room. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But so does the house." The word sent a shiver down her spine. And then she heard it. The whisper. A faint, chilling voice like a distant echo calling her name. "Sarah. Sarah." The sound was coming from everywhere. It grew louder, more insistent, until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. The figure reached out, his cold hand brushing her cheek. Her eyes widened in terror, but she couldn't move. The house had her now, and there was no escaping. The darkness that had swallowed her whole. Behind her, the door slammed shut, locking her inside. The figure's hand lingered on Sarah's cheek, the coldness of it seeping into her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. His smile twisted into something darker, more predatory. Her breath caught in her throat as her body tensed, the familiar, unsettling feeling of being watched intensifying. Who are you?" she gasped, her voice trembling. His smile deepened, but it wasn't a smile that reassured. "I told you, Sarah. Ethan is not here. But the house remembers you. It remembers your sins." Her pulse quickened as his words sank in. She turned, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. The whispers surrounded her, filling her head with voices, some familiar, some not, but all tinged with an edge of desperation. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here. It's too late now. He's waiting for you." The voice in the darkness was low, soft, and filled with an eerie sweetness that chilled her to her very core. She spun around to face the figure again, but he was gone. The room around her felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, a door creaked open at the far end of the hallway. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for only a moment before her feet moved toward it, guided by something other than her own will. As she walked toward the door, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Run! Sarah! Leave now, before it's too late!" But she couldn't move. Her legs were heavy like they were made of lead, dragging her forward into the unknown. The door opened to reveal a staircase leading down into the basement. Cold air rushed up, making her skin crawl. The stairs looked ancient, the wood warped and rotting. The air smelled of mildew and decay, thick with the scent of something long dead. But there was something else, something deeper, darker, beneath it all. "Come down, Sarah." The voice was Ethan's now, or at least it sounded like his. She felt a strange compulsion to follow, to find him, to finally end this madness. She took a step down, then another, each one sending a tremor of unease through her body. Halfway down the staircase, she heard a soft scuffling noise from below, the sound of something or someone moving in the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the bottom. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a faint, flickering bulb above her. She squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the shapes that danced at the edges of her vision. There, standing in the far corner, was Ethan, or at least someone who looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hungry. His body was unnaturally still, like he was waiting for something. But as Sarah stepped closer, something felt terribly wrong. The basement seemed to stretch further, darker than it had any right to be. The walls were lined with strange symbols, crudely carved into the stone. Her eyes traced them, feeling a chill run through her veins. The air in the room was thick with an almost tangible presence. It felt suffocating, as though the very walls were alive. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's voice echoed in her mind, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was something older, something much darker. Then, as she reached out to him, Ethan, or the thing in his skin, turned, revealing a twisted, inhuman smile. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, but it wasn't the warmth of love that she had once seen. It was the cold, empty hunger of something that had been waiting for her for a long time. "Sarah," it whispered, and the sound sent a wave of terror through her. "You were always meant to be here. The house knows you. It craves you." Suddenly, a sharp, piercing scream echoed from behind her. Sarah whipped around, her blood running cold. Standing at the top of the stairs was Ben. His face was pale, his eyes wide with horror, as if he had followed her here against his will. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Ben's voice cracked, his gaze flickering nervously to the basement. "Come, back, please, we need to leave!" Her chest tightened as her eyes locked with his. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but her body refused to move. It felt like an invisible force had her rooted in place, the weight of the house pressing down on her every movement. "Ben." Her voice was barely a whisper, caught between the cracks of fear and confusion. "You shouldn't be here." "You can't help me now." Before Ben could take another step, the basement door slammed shut behind her, trapping him outside. The cold, distant laughter of the entity in the corner filled the room, a mocking sound that sent shivers through Sarah's spine. The thing in Ethan's skin began to step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to tremble, as if the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear. "Don't you see, Sarah?" the thing whispered. "The house never forgets. It always gets what it wants." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The thing in Ethan's skin loomed closer, its eyes glowing brighter, burning with an otherworldly hunger that sent chills through Sarah's bones. She tried to take a step back, but her legs felt as if they had turned to stone, frozen in place by an unseen force. The house around her seemed to pulse, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made it harder to breathe. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking as her eyes darted between the creature and the now closed basement door. She could still hear Ben's frantic shouting from the other side, but it was distant, muffled. It felt like the walls were swallowing him whole. "You've known it all along," the thing said, its voice no longer Ethan's. Now it was deeper, echoing with a multitude of voices layered on top of one another. "The house has always been here. It's been watching, waiting for you. And now it has you." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." She choked out, the words barely escaping her lips. She wanted to scream, to run, but something inside her knew the truth now. She had already made the decision, and the house had claimed its price. The thing smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of its lips that was so wrong, so inhuman. "It is real, Sarah. Your sins have awakened it. Your heart, torn between love and betrayal, is the key that binds you to this place." Its eyes narrowed. "And now, you will become part of it." With a sudden violent movement, it lunged at her, its fingers clawing toward her throat. But just before its touch made contact, the basement door behind her exploded open with a deafening crack, and Ben's voice cut through the air. "Sarah!" She turned, her eyes wild with fear, and in that instant, everything seemed to slow. Ben was rushing toward her, his hands outstretched, his face a mask of desperation and disbelief. But as he reached her, the room seemed to shift. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and the walls of the house seemed to contort, bending and groaning like a living, breathing entity. The shadows in the corners writhed, reaching for him. Ben was almost to her when the creature's voice boomed louder than the storm outside. "No one escapes this house, Sarah. Not you, not him." The moment the words were spoken, the shadows erupted. From the walls, dark tendrils shot toward Ben, wrapping around his arms, his legs, pulling him back with unrelenting force. He screamed as they dragged him away, his eyes locked on Sarah's in a moment of pure terror. "Ben!" she screamed, reaching out to him, but the shadows yanked him farther into the darkness, his cries growing fainter until they were swallowed by the cold, thick air. The basement seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. Her chest tightened as she fought to breathe, her mind a blur of panic and confusion. The creature in Ethan's skin advanced again, now standing mere inches from her. "You think you can escape this?" it hissed. "You are the reason this house is alive, Sarah. You brought the darkness into it, and now you will be part of it forever." Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled backward, her heart breaking at the thought of Ben, his anguished face still burned into her mind. She had dragged him into this nightmare. She had been too weak to stop herself. But it's not too late. A small voice whispered in the back of her mind. "You still have a choice." A flash of clarity pierced the fog of her fear. She remembered the symbols on the walls, symbols that had seemed so meaningless before, but now they felt familiar, like a key she had overlooked. Her hand shot out, grabbing at the nearest wall. The cold stone felt alive beneath her fingers, vibrating as if it responded to her touch. Her heart raced. "Get away from me!" she screamed, as the tendrils of darkness reached for her again, but this time her voice was stronger. Her fingers traced the symbols, the ancient carvings that lined the walls, whispering to her. She didn't know how, but she felt them guiding her. And then, as her fingertips brushed a certain symbol, a symbol that resembled an eye, the air around her seemed to crackle. The house shuddered violently, the ground beneath her feet buckling. She gasped as the shadows recoiled, the grip on her tightening. The creature hissed in fury, its inhuman eyes burning with rage. "What have you done?" The house screamed in agony. The walls groaned, and a terrible, suffocating pressure pushed down on Sarah, as if the very foundation of the place was crumbling. "I'm ending this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. She closed her eyes, focusing on the energy that had come alive within her, pulling strength from deep within the house, from the darkness that had tried to consume her. She could feel the power, dark, twisted, ancient, coursing through her veins. With one final, desperate effort, Sarah slammed her hand onto the symbol. The house howled in pain as cracks began to appear in the walls. The air outside felt strangely warm, almost unnaturally so, as if the storm had never existed at all. Sarah stood in the doorway, her heart still racing, her thoughts spinning. She glanced back at Ben, seeing the confusion and fear in his eyes, the shock that still held him frozen in place. Her throat tightened, guilt washing over her once more. He stepped toward her, his movements slow, as if he too was unsure of the reality of what had just happened. The house loomed behind them, silent now, its windows like dark, empty eyes. "Sarah," Ben's voice was hoarse. "What happened? What the hell was that place? Before he could finish, a chill breeze swept through the door, and Sarah instinctively stepped back, her eyes wide with sudden dread. The door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. She turned back, a sickening sense of déjà vu washing over her. The silence was too still. The house felt alive again, its presence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She could feel the pulse beneath the floorboards, the rhythm of the house's breath, almost like a heartbeat in the dark. Ben's hand found hers, pulling her away from the door. "Let's go. We need to leave now." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The darkness had never truly left the house. It lingered in the corners, in the space between the walls, watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. "We can't," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think it's still here, Ben. It's not finished." Ben's eyes softened, but his expression was tinged with confusion and worry. "What do you mean? The house is just a house. It's over. We're free." But Sarah shook her head. No. Something's still here. I can feel it. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet shuddered, with an unnatural force. A low growl reverberated from the depths of the house, like something ancient awakening. The walls seemed to twist, their wooden beams groaning as if they were being pulled inwards by an unseen force. The air turned cold again, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch. "Ben!" she gasped, her voice rising in panic. "It's coming back!" Ben turned to face her, but his expression faltered as the house seemed to shift around them, the lights flickering, the shadows growing long and twisted. The floorboards creaked with every step they took, as if something was chasing them, moving just out of sight. The door they had just closed burst open with a violent crash, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway. But the shape was wrong, distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The figure swayed unnaturally, its form flickering in and out of existence. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding, a scream caught in her throat. It's not over," she whispered, terror clutching at her. Ben grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the front door, but the moment they reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room around them twisted again, as if reality itself was folding in on itself. "Sarah, what's happening?" Ben demanded, panic rising in his voice. "We need to get out of here, now!" But before she could answer, the house groaned again, a low, malevolent sound that seemed to come from every corner of the space. The figure in the doorway, the thing that had once taken the form of Ethan, was now standing in front of them, blocking the exit. Its face was no longer recognizable, twisted and broken in ways that made Sarah's stomach churn. Its eyes were black voids, endless and hollow, filled with the suffering of those who had come before her. "You're not leaving, Sarah," it said, its voice rasping like the sound of bones cracking. "You never will." Ben reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. His hand pulled away, leaving a streak of blood behind. "Why? Why won't it open?" he shouted, his voice breaking with fear. Sarah's mind raced. She remembered the symbols in the basement, the ones she had touched before. Could it be the same? Had she missed something vital that could break the hold of the house? The house was feeding off their fear. She could feel it now, like a force of nature, draining their energy, their hope. The walls seemed to lean closer, like they were listening to their every breath. And the thing in front of them, it wasn't just some ghost or a spirit. It was the house itself, wearing the guise of Ethan to draw them back into its web. "We have to get out," Sarah said, more to herself than to Ben, her voice trembling. "We have to find a way to stop this." Ben was already pulling at the door again, his muscles straining against the weight of whatever supernatural force held it closed. But there was no give. No way out. The creature stepped forward, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. "It's too late for you, Sarah. You're part of the house now, and so is he." A cold wind swept through the room, swirling around them, and Sarah's body stiffened. The air was thick, suffocating. Sarah's feet echoed through the house, the sound a steady drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Every step she took, the house seemed to respond, its walls groaning, its floors creaking under her weight. It was watching her. She could feel it. Its eyes were everywhere, buried in the very fabric of the walls, in the shifting shadows, in the very air she breathed. She tightened her grip on the symbol she had found in the basement, the one that had nearly destroyed her, the one that had awakened the curse within the house. It pulsed in her hand, a cold, heavy weight. She didn't understand its power, but she felt it in her veins, coursing through her like a strange lifeblood. She didn't have time to think. The house wouldn't let her. The house was alive, and it wanted her. She stumbled through the hall, past rooms she could no longer recognize, their twisted shapes a mockery of the house she had once known. The stairs were gone, replaced by an endless chasm of blackness that threatened to swallow her whole. Her breath came in short, desperate bursts as she pushed forward, refusing to stop, refusing to give in. "It won't take me," she thought fiercely, gripping the symbol even tighter. Not again. But as she moved deeper into the house, the darkness grew thicker, more oppressive. It wasn't just in the corners anymore. It was in the air, in her lungs, crawling beneath her skin. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, as though the house were breathing with her. The floor shifted beneath her feet, as though the very foundation was warping, reshaping itself, trapping her in an endless maze of twisted rooms and narrow hallways. And then she saw it. The thing that had once been Ethan, or had it? She wasn't sure anymore. It stood at the far end of the hallway, its form flickering like a broken light, shifting between what had been Ethan's face and something far darker, something that no longer resembled humanity. Its eyes were black voids, filled with endless, writhing pain. Its mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin, jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Sarah," it whispered, its voice 1,000 voices, all overlapping, all twisted. "You thought you could escape. You thought you could stop me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She felt the fear rise again, clawing at her chest, but she pushed it back. She couldn't afford to let the house get to her. Not now. "You're not Ethan," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You're just a part of this house, a thing I created." The creature's laugh was hollow, empty, as if it were mocking her. "No, Sarah, you did not create me. I am part of you. I always have been. Your guilt, your fear, your betrayal." The figure stepped forward, its form flickering with the energy of the house. "You cannot outrun yourself." With a cry, Sarah turned and ran, the sound of the thing's footsteps following close behind her, echoing off the walls. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to keep moving. Every instinct told her she was running out of time, that the house was closing in on her, suffocating her. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. The weight of the symbol in her hand seemed to grow heavier, as if the house was trying to tear it from her grasp. But she clung to it, her fingers white-knuckled, determined. It was the only thing that had ever given her hope. She reached the end of the hallway, where the light was dim and flickering. A door, the same door she had seen earlier, was open just a crack. She didn't know where it led, but she felt the pull, an unexplainable force urging her forward. Without hesitation, she shoved the door open and stumbled into the room. It was the same room. The room where she had first seen the symbols. The room where the creature had come into being. The walls were covered in the ancient, cryptic markings, glowing faintly in the low light. There were no windows here, no doors, just the symbols surrounding her, pressing in. She knew what she had to do. She turned to face the center of the room, her breath ragged, her chest burning from the exertion. The shadows closed in on her, and the figure of Ethan, no, the thing, was behind her again, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. "I will consume you, Sarah," it whispered, its voice slithering into her mind. "There is no escape. You are mine." Sarah shut her eyes, blocking out the creature's words. She could hear it behind her, feel its breath on her neck, but she focused only on the symbol in her hand. Her fingers traced its shape, moving over the cold surface as if it had a mind of its own. The air in the room crackled, vibrating with a terrible energy. The house itself seemed to groan, a low, deafening rumble that made her bones ache. The shadows writhed, reaching for her, but she stood her ground. "Not today," Sarah whispered, her voice steady and resolute. She pressed the symbol against the wall, feeling the energy surge through her fingertips. The room shook violently, the air thick with power. The voice, low, suffocating, haunting, whispered through the empty air, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She froze, her pulse quickening as the words echoed, reverberating through her thoughts. The house had been silenced, yes, but the presence of it lingered, like a dark shadow cast over everything she'd just fought to escape. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the whisper, but there was nothing. The walls were bare, the flickering light dimming slowly as the air grew colder. She gripped the symbol in her hand tighter, feeling the cool surface against her skin, as if it were still connected to something far beyond her comprehension. It's never truly over. The thought gnawed at her. Was the house gone? Had she really escaped? Or was this just another layer of its trap, another nightmare to torment her for the rest of her days? Sarah backed toward the door, her feet dragging across the floor. She needed to leave, to get out of this place. The weight in her chest grew heavier with every step. Every instinct told her that she wasn't safe, that the house's grip had only loosened, never fully released. When she reached the threshold of the room, she hesitated. The door before her seemed almost too inviting, but the hesitation rooted her in place. She couldn't leave without knowing the truth. What happened to Ben? Ben? She whispered again, softer this time, as though the word could summon him back from wherever he had gone. There was no answer, no creaking of floorboards, no distant movement, just the heavy silence of the house. But then, as if on cue, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper, so quiet she almost thought it was her imagination. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the far end of the hallway, was a figure, tall, angular, draped in shadows. Ben? Her voice cracked, desperate for an answer, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't move. The shadows around it seemed to twist unnaturally, stretching and twisting like a thing of its own. It was as if the house itself had begun to shape the darkness around this figure, like a living entity in the form of a man. Ben? She tried again, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, and then it spoke. Sarah. The voice was not Ben's. It was distorted, a hollow, unnatural echo that sent a chill straight to her bones. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively took a step back. You're not him, she said, her voice shaking, though she willed herself to stay calm. The figure's face was an inky void, its features shifting like oil on water. The shadow was pulling at its form, distorting it. Who are you? The figure tilted its head, its shadowy hands stretching toward her as it took another step forward. It was Ben's shape, but not his soul. Sarah could feel it now, feel the wrongness in the air. I am what remains, the figure whispered, its voice sounding more like a rasping wind than anything human. What the house left behind. What you made me. Made you? Sarah felt her legs buckle beneath her. Her knees hit the floor, and the air around her grew heavier still. She grasped at the floor, the cold wood pressing into her palms. You. The figure's voice echoed in her ears, filling her mind. You fed me. You created me with your fear, your guilt, your betrayal. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't even a ghost. It was a thing, the embodiment of everything the house had taken from her, the twisted echo of her own soul. No, she whispered fiercely, shaking her head. You're not real. You're a part of the house. You're just a nightmare. The figure's laugh filled the room, the sound deep and unnatural, like bones cracking underfoot. It moved closer still, its form flickering, no longer even resembling Ben at all. Its face morphed into something monstrous. Too many eyes, too many mouths, too many shapes and angles to count. You cannot deny me, Sarah, it rasped. I am you. I am what you tried to outrun. The air grew colder still, and Sarah could feel the pressure building in her chest, suffocating her as though the house itself was forcing its way back into her lungs. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowering, and the floor seemed to split beneath her feet. The creature, it cackled, its voice echoing through the room like the screech of an iron nail dragging across stone. "You can never be free of me. You made me." Sarah's vision blurred. The house was no longer just a building. It was inside her, its pulse beating with hers. The guilt, the fear, the pain, all of it had bled into the very fabric of her existence. And now, the house was reaching into her very soul, making sure she could never escape. A wave of overwhelming despair crashed over her, and for a moment, she thought she might break. But then, deep within, something sparked. A flicker of the strength she had found in herself earlier. No, the symbol. The thing that had once held so much power. It wasn't just a talisman. Sarah stood in the shattered remnants of the house, the ruins of her once home now crumbling away before her eyes. The walls were disintegrating, the floors buckling under the weight of its own destruction. The shadows that had once reached for her now lay still, as though they had lost the power to move. Her breath was ragged, every inhale sharp and painful, as though her very lungs were still adjusting to the sudden absence of the oppressive weight that had once haunted her every moment. But something still lingered, hanging like an invisible shroud around her, an echo of everything she had lost. Ben. Her heart ached with the thought of him. She had tried so hard, fought so fiercely to escape the curse that had bound them both to this house. But it had claimed him. The love they had once shared, the life they had planned was gone, destroyed by the house, by the darkness within it. And now, in the aftermath, she was left to pick up the pieces. But as she stood there, staring at the crumbling walls, she realized something. The house was gone, yes, but the battle, the true battle, wasn't over. It had only shifted, from the physical to the mental. From the horrors of the house to the terror that still lived in her heart. She clutched the symbol in her hand once more, its cool surface grounding her in the present. The symbol was fading, its light dimming with each passing moment, but she knew its power had been real. She had broken the house, broken its hold on her. But it had taken something of her in return. It had taken Ben. She could still hear the faint echoes of the thing that had once been him, the distorted voice, the hollow eyes that had watched her with such emptiness. It was a reminder that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she had tried to outrun it, the darkness had claimed a part of her soul. She felt the weight of the house's presence behind her, like a dark stain seeping into the fabric of her being. It wasn't gone. It wasn't just a physical structure. It had burrowed into her mind, into her thoughts, and now it was a part of her, a reminder, a specter she could never escape. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With every step, every breath, the house was fading, retreating into the recesses of her memory, but she could feel its lingering pulse, a pulse that would remain in her until the day she faced it once more. She needed to go. She needed to move forward. But the path wasn't clear. She wasn't sure where to go, what to do, or how to rebuild a life that had been broken beyond recognition. But she did know one thing. She couldn't go back to the past. Ben, she thought, her chest aching. You gave me strength. I will keep going for you, for both of us. Her feet were slow at first, hesitant, the uncertainty of her future hanging heavily in the air. But each step she took, the weight of her past loosened just a little, just enough for her to breathe. The house had been a prison, but now, even though it had taken everything from her, it had given her something too, something she would carry, with her always, the will to fight. And so, as the house continued to crumble into dust behind her, Sarah walked away from it. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know how long it would take to heal, or if she ever would. But one thing was clear, the darkness had not consumed her. She had survived, and as long as she drew breath, she would keep fighting, one step, one breath, one day at a time, and maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to move on, even without Ben, even without the house. Her journey, whatever it might be, had just begun. Sarah walked slowly, the weight of each step both grounding and carrying her forward. The world beyond the ruins of the house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She didn't know where to go, didn't know if she could even return to the life she had left behind. But she couldn't stay here. She couldn't remain in the ruins of the place that had taken so much from her. The house had taken her husband. It had taken her sanity, her peace, and in some ways, it had taken her soul. But it had not taken her will. As she walked, the house's final breath behind her seemed to follow, like a lingering shadow, whispering on the edges of her thoughts. Her hand still gripped the symbol, its once glowing surface now dull, its power drained, but it was a reminder that she had broken something, and perhaps in doing so, she had freed herself, or at least she hoped she had. She didn't know how long she had been walking, her footsteps a constant rhythm in her ears, the landscape passing by in a blur of trees and fields, when she saw a small village up ahead. The houses were modest, tucked, in a valley with a lazy river winding through. People moved about their day with an ease Sarah envied. No shadows lurked here, no darkness pressing in on her from every direction. It was an ordinary place, far removed from the horrors of the house. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her to go there, to find some semblance of normalcy, to attempt to start again. Her body moved instinctively, her legs carrying her toward the village without a second thought. As she entered the village, the first person she encountered was an elderly woman sitting on a bench outside a small shop, knitting a sweater with nimble fingers. The woman looked up as Sarah passed, her eyes sharp and knowing, though her face remained calm and untroubled. "Lost your way, dear?" The woman's voice was kind, but there was an edge to it, as if she had seen more than most. Sarah hesitated, her instinct telling her to keep walking, to continue forward without looking back. But something about the woman's presence felt like an anchor in the vast, chaotic ocean that had been her life recently. She stopped. I'm not sure," Sarah admitted, feeling a strange pull toward the older woman. She had never been one to confide in strangers, but something about this place, about this moment, felt like it had a purpose. "I'm just trying to find a way forward." The woman studied her for a long moment, her sharp gaze reading Sarah, as though she were an open book. Then, with a knowing nod, she patted the seat beside her. "Sometimes the way forward is hidden," the woman said softly. "But it's always there. You just have to be willing to see it." Sarah sat down next. To her, the weight in her chest easing just slightly. The village, the woman, the calm. Everything felt like a brief reprieve from the storm that still churned in her heart. "Do you know what it's like?" Sarah started hesitantly. "To lose everything? To have it all ripped away in the blink of an eye and have nothing left?" The old woman nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "Oh, child, I've known loss. Everyone has. But what matters is what you choose to do with what's left. You can let the dark things inside you define who you are, or you can decide to be something more. Something that isn't consumed by the past." Sarah stared out at the quiet village street, her mind spinning. The house, Ben, the darkness, it was all still there, locked away in the deepest corners of her thoughts, festering. Could she truly move on? Could she truly let go of the past? She looked down at the symbol in her hand, now nothing more than a worn piece of metal tarnished by the battle it had been through. But as she turned it over in her palm, she realized something. The power wasn't in the object itself. The power was in her. She had the strength to carry it, to hold on, even when everything else seemed to break. She looked back at the woman, meeting her gaze. "How do I find the strength to go on?" The woman's eyes twinkled with a quiet wisdom. "Strength is not something you find, child. It's something you choose to cultivate. Every moment, every decision you make. The strength is in how you move forward, how you live with what's left of your soul after the darkness has passed. You have a choice. The house may have taken your past, but your future is yours to shape." Sarah sat in silence for a long, while the weight of the woman's words settling deep into her heart. She had been running for so long, escaping, hiding, surviving, but now it was time to stop, time to heal, time to rebuild. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, her expression filled with a deep, knowing peace. "Go on, dear. The future waits for you, and the path is always open, no matter how far you've wandered. You just have to take that first step." The village stretched out before Sarah like a peaceful canvas. The simple life it offered so stark in contrast to the tangled web of darkness that had consumed her for so long. Each step she took felt different, more purposeful than before. The air, so crisp and pure, wrapped around her like a protective cloak. The small village was alive with the mundane rhythm of life. Children playing near the river, farmers tending to their fields, and the distant hum of birds fluttering through the trees. But even as Sarah felt this new sense of peace, there was a lingering ache deep within her. The house's shadow, though faded, had left a mark on her soul, a reminder that what she had been through was not something that could be so easily washed away. And yet she couldn't help but feel the faintest stirrings of something else. Hope. It was late afternoon when Sarah wandered toward a small cafe tucked between two modest cottages, its weathered wooden sign swaying gently in the breeze. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans wafted out as she pushed open the door. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting, its cozy wooden tables scattered with people chatting, their laughter a sound that felt almost foreign to her. Now, a sense of normalcy, of community, of belonging. At the counter, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted her. "New in town?" the woman asked, her voice friendly but with an edge of curiosity. Sarah nodded. "Just passing through. Trying to figure things out." The woman smiled gently. "Well, you've come to the right place. There's no better place to catch your breath than here. What can I get you?" Sarah glanced around. The cafe was small, but the atmosphere felt grounding, like it held a secret calm that soothed the soul. She ordered a coffee, settling into a corner by the window where the late afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the worn wooden floor. As she waited, she absent-mindedly ran her fingers over the symbol in her pocket, its edges smooth but its power still there, faint yet undeniable. "Thank you," Sarah said when the woman returned with her coffee. "This place, it's like a breath of fresh air." The woman laughed lightly. "That's the idea. Sometimes we all need a little peace, especially after everything life throws our way." Sarah couldn't help but smile back. It felt so simple, so normal. Too normal. It was strange to feel this calm after everything that had happened, but it was exactly what she needed. She needed to start over, find a place where the noise of her past couldn't reach her, at least for a little while. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. The woman left her to her thoughts, but before she walked away, she paused, her gaze lingering for a moment. "You know, the village has a history," she said quietly, her tone suddenly serious. "It might be small, but we've had our share of things we'd rather forget." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of things?" The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if unsure about speaking. Further. Nothing that matters now. Just people have come through here. People like you, maybe. People who are running from something. There was an unspoken understanding in the air. Something about this village, Sarah realized, was more than just a quiet, charming little town. There was a history of people, strangers coming to it. And though it might not be spoken aloud, Sarah could sense that the village was not as innocent as it appeared. "How do you know about people like me?" Sarah asked, leaning forward slightly. The woman smiled gently, but with a knowing glint in her eyes. "Oh, sweetie, we know when someone's in need of a place to heal. This town it's like a refuge. People find themselves here, for better or worse. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they don't." Sarah felt a chill in the air, though the room had not changed. She could feel the weight of the woman's words settling into her chest, another reminder that her journey had not ended. It was just beginning. This village might offer her the respite she craved, but she knew the past had a way of following. As she sat there, staring at her coffee cup, she began to wonder if she would ever truly escape the shadow of the house. Perhaps it wasn't just the house that had shaped her, but the very fear of facing the unknown, of confronting the darkest parts of herself. Just then, the door opened with a soft chime, and a man walked in, tall, with dark hair, and an aura of quiet confidence. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Sarah, and she felt an odd, almost electric charge in the air. He didn't look like much. His face was ordinary, his clothes simple, but there was something undeniably familiar about him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned away, approaching the counter. But that brief moment lingered, as if something had passed between them, something neither of them could explain. As Sarah walked down the village streets, her steps seemed to echo in the silence, each one pulling her deeper into the unknown. The light was fading now, and the once welcoming village seemed to grow quieter, more distant. She glanced back toward the cafe, wondering about the man and the strange sense of foreboding that clung to her like a second skin. Something had shifted. It wasn't just the village's history she had felt. It was her own. Every instinct in her told her to leave, to escape before it was too late. But her feet carried her forward, drawn to the feeling that something or someone needed her here. She wasn't sure what that was yet. What she did know was that whatever had followed her from the house had not yet finished its work. She reached the edge of the village, where the land opened up to fields of tall, swaying grass. In the distance, a small, dilapidated house stood, alone, almost as if it were watching her. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the house she had come from, the house that had twisted her love, her marriage, into something grotesque. But it felt like it. The same kind of loneliness clung to it, the same eerie isolation. Without thinking, Sarah moved toward it, compelled by a force she couldn't name. She tried to fight the instinct, to resist the pull, but something inside her refused to let go. The air around the house felt thick with secrets, heavy with the scent of decay. The wind had stopped, and for a moment everything felt suspended, as if the world were holding its breath. She reached the creaking wooden door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the stillness, as if the house itself were waking up from a long slumber. Inside, dust and shadows danced in the dim light filtering through cracked windows. The house was small, but the air felt suffocating, as though it had witnessed countless forgotten lives. Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that covered the floor. The interior was eerily familiar, the same feeling of abandonment she had felt in the house from her past, the same heavy atmosphere of something waiting. But there was something else, too, a subtle sense of déjà vu, like she had been here before, in another life, or perhaps in a dream. She wandered through the rooms, each one darker than the last, until she found herself standing at the foot of a staircase that descended into the earth. The stairs were narrow, their wooden steps slick with age, and as she stared down into the blackness, a faint whispering drifted up, as if the house itself was speaking to her, calling her deeper. Into its bowels, Ben. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. She wasn't sure why she said it, why she still clung to the memory of him, of their life together. She should have let go. She had let go. But somehow, this place, this house, was pulling her. Back to him, to the past, to the horror. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the house were answering her call. Her pulse quickened, and her breath came in shallow gasps. A force beyond her control was pulling her down into the depths. She tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. She had to see it through. She had to know why this place felt so familiar, so connected to the darkness that had consumed her life. Slowly, Sarah descended the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, the air growing colder with each step. The whispering intensified. Now voices, many voices, murmuring from the depths, calling her name, urging her forward. She reached the bottom of the stairs, where the darkness was absolute, and then, in the pitch black, she saw it. The faintest glimmer of light like a beacon, just beyond her reach. Something, someone, was there. She could feel it, their presence, drawing her closer. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her hand outstretched, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. As her fingers brushed against the cold stone wall, a flash of memories hit her. Visions of Ben, of their life before the house, before the darkness. The moments they had shared, the love they had built. And then, the nightmare. She stumbled, forward, and her eyes locked onto the source of the light, a mirror. Its surface shimmered, distorted, as if it were not a mirror at all, but a window into another world, a world that felt far too familiar. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was him, Ben. His face was distorted, his eyes hollow, as though he were trapped within the glass. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold surface, and his hand reached out to her, pressing against the other side. "Sarah, help me," his voice whispered, though his lips never moved. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stared at the image before her. It was him. But it wasn't him. His form was distorted, twisted by the very darkness that had consumed the house. The thing that had taken him was still there. Sarah stood frozen, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as she locked eyes with the man in the field. The shadows of the night stretched long between them, but even from this distance she could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he were watching her soul, peeling back the layers of her very being. The air crackled, thick with tension, and for a moment she wondered if the earth itself had stopped breathing. He didn't move at first, just stood there, still, his figure, framed against the fading light of the horizon. His face was as ordinary as she remembered from the cafe, dark, angular, with that sharpness in his eyes that unsettled her, but something in his stance, in the way he held himself, was different. It wasn't just the lingering sense of recognition between them. It was the unmistakable feeling that he had been waiting for her, as though he had known this moment would come. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest as her mind raced to make sense of it all. She had left the house. She had broken free. So why was the darkness still following her? Why had it found her here, in this quiet, peaceful village? The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, each step carrying an unnerving certainty. The earth seemed to part beneath his feet, the shadows pooling around him, as if they too recognized his presence. Sarah's legs trembled beneath her, but she refused to turn away, to run. She had faced the horror of the house, She couldn't let this man or whatever he represented take her now. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering, as though he were waiting for her to say something, to acknowledge the truth that had always been there, buried beneath the surface. "You're not free," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic, like the rustle of wind through dead leaves. Sarah flinched, her fingers twitching at her sides. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound firm. She wanted to demand answers, to scream. But something in the back of her mind, some ancient, primal instinct, told her that it wasn't the right time. The man smiled then, a slow, knowing grin, like a secret that was just out of reach. "I've always wanted something from you, Sarah. Something you can never give willingly." His eyes gleamed, cold and dark. "But you will. You always have." She shook her head, backing away, instinctively putting distance between them. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. No, she couldn't let him get inside her mind again. She was stronger now. She was free. "I've already let go of it. Of him," Sarah said, forcing her voice to steady. Her gaze flicked toward the distant house, the one that had twisted her life into something unrecognizable, but she kept her focus on him. "I've let go of the house. Of Ben. I don't need you. I'm done." The man's expression remained unchanged, but the air around them seemed to grow colder, as though he had unleashed some invisible pressure on her chest. "You think you're free, but you've never truly escaped, Sarah. Not while the house still calls to you, not while it still owns a part of you." His words sliced through the air, a poison she hadn't anticipated. Her breath caught, and for the briefest moment, her mind slipped back to the cellar, to the mirror, to the distorted image of Ben begging for her help. She had left him there, hadn't she? She had turned away. But had she? No. She shook her head again, forcing herself to stay present. That wasn't Ben. Whatever had once been him was gone. The thing in the mirror had been a reflection of the darkness that had consumed him, not the man she had loved, and she had made her choice. "I'm done," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, though the chill in the air seemed to bite deeper with every word. "You can't have me anymore." The man's smile faded, replaced by something far darker, more unsettling. "You think the darkness cares about your will?" he sneered. "It's been waiting for you, Sarah, watching, biding its time. The house, the mirror, me. It's all part of the same curse, the curse you were born into." The world around them seemed to shift, the village fading into the background as the ground beneath Sarah's feet felt soft and shifting, as if she were standing in the middle of a dream that was beginning to unravel. The man's eyes flickered briefly to the sky above, and as if on cue, the moon broke free from the clouds, casting an eerie silver light over them. Shadows stretched across the field, twisting unnaturally, their edges sharp and jagged. "You don't get it, do you?" he continued, his voice growing colder. "You can't run from this. No matter how far you go, the house will follow. The curse will follow. It's in your blood. It's in all of you." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest. Her blood? What did he mean by that? She stepped back again, her legs trembling. But there was no escape. Not from him, not from the curse. A distant cry broke through the air, faint but unmistakable. The wind howled louder now, its icy fingers tugging at Sarah's hair and clothes, as if trying to pull her into the darkness that surrounded her. The whisper of Ben's voice grew frantic, desperate, as if it were coming from the very earth, beneath her feet, rising up through the ground, calling her deeper into the abyss. "Sarah, please, help me." It was a cry she could no longer ignore, no longer deny. The very core of her being screamed to run, to escape, to shut it all out. But she knew she couldn't. She couldn't leave Ben, not like this. Not when his voice, his torment, was wrapped so tightly around her heart. The man, no, the creature standing before her, seemed to feed off her confusion, her inner turmoil. His expression twisted into something cruel, something satisfied. "Do you hear him, Sarah? Your beloved Ben? You'll never get him back. He's already gone." His voice was like ice, each word cutting deeper, like a dagger digging into her very soul. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as she fought to steady herself. She had to hold on. She had to keep her grip on reality, on herself. If she let go, if she allowed herself to be consumed by the chaos and the darkness that was closing in on her, she'd lose everything. But her mind felt fragile. Her heart wavered. The man stepped closer, so close now that she could smell the faint scent of decay, of things long dead. His presence was suffocating, like a shadow that blocked out the light. "You think you can save him? He's already lost to the house, Sarah, to the curse. There's nothing left of him. And if you're foolish enough to follow that path, you'll become a part of the curse too." She could see it then, a flicker of something in his eyes, something more ancient than anything she could comprehend. He wasn't just a man. He was a manifestation of the house itself, of the darkness that had taken root in her life. He was the thing that had caused all of it, the entity that had twisted her marriage, her love, her very soul. Sarah could feel her pulse thudding in her ears as her vision blurred. The house was alive. It wasn't just a place. It was a force, a living thing, a nightmare that had spread its tendrils through everything she had ever loved, everything she had ever been. And now, it wanted her. "You think you're free?" he continued, his voice lowering into a growl. "But the house knows better. It's always wanted you, and now, you're here. You're mine." Sarah's mind raced, but through the terror that gripped her, a flicker of clarity rose within her. No, she wasn't going to let this thing consume her like it had consumed Ben. She had a choice. She had always had a choice. She gripped the symbol in her pocket again, the one that had once been a tether to the dark forces that had controlled her life. Her fingers were cold, but she could feel its power pulsing, faint but real. The curse had been there since the beginning. Yes, but it wasn't who she was. She could fight it. She had to fight it. "No," Sarah said, her voice trembling but rising with a newfound strength. "You don't get to have me." For a moment, the air was thick with silence. Even the wind stilled as though the world was holding its breath. The man, the creature, stared at her, his face an unreadable mask, his eyes still glowing with malice. Then, without warning, he lunged at her, his form blurring as if reality itself bent around him. But Sarah was ready. With a primal scream, she shoved the symbol forward, pressing it hard into the air between them. A sharp, blinding light erupted from the symbol, flooding the space around her, crackling with energy that felt ancient and alive. The man recoiled, his body writhing as if the light were burning through him. His eyes widened in pain as the shadows around him began to disintegrate, the form of the creature flickering like smoke in the wind. "No!" he hissed, his voice warping, losing its once calm authority. "You can't!" But Sarah didn't let up. She pushed the symbol forward, focusing every ounce of her strength into it, every bit of will she could muster. The darkness that had consumed her, that had twisted her life, was clawing at her, trying to break her, but she wasn't going to let it. Not now. Not anymore. The air crackled violently, a storm of light and shadow swirling between them, and with a final explosive burst of energy, the man, the creature, let out an inhuman scream as his form was ripped apart, his dark power dissipating into the ether, consumed by the very light Sarah had called forth. For a moment, everything was still. The storm had passed. The man was gone. The darkness had been forced back. Sarah stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. Her hands were shaking, and she could still feel the residue of the darkness clinging to her skin. But it wasn't as strong as before. The village was silent, the field bathed in the soft light of the moon.